There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening, the low hum of the city outside your window, the scent of cooling tea on the coffee table. They were the camouflage of routine so perfectly that you don't recognize their weight until much, much later, when you look back and see the fine, hairline crack they left in the foundation of everything you thought you knew. For me, that moment was a question, spoken so softly it was nearly absorbed by the worn fabric of the couch we shared. It was a question that had been living in the space between us for months, a silent ghost I had painstakingly ignored, and hearing it given voice was like watching a photographer finally open the shutter in a room he'd only ever observed through the keyhole. He had been quiet for a long time, Julian. Not the comfortable quiet we were used to, the kind that filled the space between pages of a book or the scenes of a movie, but a dense, thoughtful silence that seemed to have its own gravity. He sat beside me, his shoulder a warm, solid pressure against my own, his gaze fixed on the shifting patterns of headlights on the far wall. His leg was pressed against mine from hip to knee, a line of contact that I was so acutely aware of it felt like a brand. For months, this proximity had become our new language, a dialect of touch and shared space that I had been terrified to translate. I had told myself it was born of his need, a simple seeking of comfort after the implosion of his world. I was his friend, his anchor. That was my role, the one I had accepted and polished until it shone with the dull gleam of platonic duty. But in the quiet of my own mind, in the darkroom where I developed the truth, I knew I was lying to myself. The city exhaled a distant siren, and he shifted, the slight movement sending a tremor through my entire body. I kept my eyes on my hands, resting on my lap, trying to appear as placid as a lake at dawn. Inside, a storm was raging. I could feel the question forming in the air around him, the pressure changing in the room. It was the same feeling I got right before a lightning strike, a static charge that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I held my breath, waiting. He turned his head, and I could feel his gaze on the side of my face. I didn't look at him. I couldn't. To look at him would be to confess everything my own silence was trying to hide. "Leo," he said, and my name was a soft, frayed thing. I finally turned to meet his eyes. In the dim light of the living room, they were dark pools, reflecting the distant city lights. The usual easy confidence that he wore like a second skin was gone, replaced by a vulnerability so raw and open it made my chest ache. It was the face of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, wondering if the air would hold him. Then came the words. "Do you ever feel like things have changed between us?" And there it was. The ordinary Tuesday, the cooling tea, the worn couch, all of it falling away to reveal the precipice we had been standing on all along. The shutter clicked. The image was captured. Nothing would ever be ordinary again. To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship. Julian and I were a study in contrasts, a fact that had been obvious from the day we met in a crowded university lecture hall. He was light, and I was shadow. He was the easy, booming laugh that could fill a room, the casual confidence that drew people to him like moths. I was the quiet observer in the corner, the one who noticed the details others missed, content to exist on the periphery. He was a force of nature, a summer thunderstorm, all bright flashes and resonant sound. I was the still, deep water that reflected the storm, holding its image without being broken by it. We were assigned as partners for a semester-long project, and I had been quietly terrified. My world was one of controlled variables and careful compositions, both in my photography and in my life. Julian's world seemed to be one of joyful, chaotic motion. I remember that first meeting in the library. He'd arrived 10 minutes late, smelling faintly of rain and coffee, his hair a mess, a wide, apologetic grin already disarming my carefully constructed annoyance. He dropped a stack of books onto the table that made a sound like a gunshot, and several people glared. He just grinned wider. "Sorry," he'd whispered, though his whisper was louder than my normal speaking voice. Got caught up, he didn't say in what. With Julian, you learned that he was often caught up in the simple act of living, swept away by a conversation, a song, a sudden impulse to walk across campus just to see the way the late afternoon sun hit the old clock tower. I, on the other hand, was never caught up. I was deliberate. I was planned. Somehow it worked. He was the engine, all horsepower and forward momentum, generating ideas with a dizzying, frantic energy. I was the rudder and the compass, quietly steering his brilliant chaos into a coherent form. He would talk for hours, pacing around our small study corral, waving his hands, his mind a fireworks display of concepts and connections. I would listen, sketching notes, finding the through line, the core of the idea that was worth pursuing. I became his editor, his curator. He would throw 100 raw, unformed ideas at me, and I would hand him back the one polished gem. "How do you do that?" he'd asked me once, genuinely mystified. "It's like you can hear what I'm trying to say. Even when I can't," I'd just shrugged, unable to explain that I had been studying him, learning his language, his rhythms, the way a naturalist learns the patterns of a rare and beautiful creature. That semester turned into a year, and then 4. We became an inseparable, if unlikely, pair. His friends, a rotating cast of bright, loud athletes and fellow engineering students, accepted me with a sort of cheerful confusion. I was Julian's quiet friend, the guy who was always there but rarely the center of attention. I didn't mind. In fact, I preferred it. It gave me the perfect vantage point. From my quiet corner, I could watch him. I learned the subtle shift in his posture when he was getting tired, the way he'd run a hand through his hair when he was stressed, the slight dip in the corner of his mouth that meant he was genuinely happy, not just performing happiness for the room. These were the details my photographers I was trained to see, the nuances that composed the real portrait of the man beneath the vibrant surface. It was sometime in our junior year that the foundation of my own world developed a crack. It wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, creeping realization, like watching a photograph develop in a tray of chemicals. The image had always been there, latent, but it took time for it to emerge from the ether. I was in the campus darkroom, the red safe light casting everything in an infernal, intimate glow. I was working on a portrait series, and Julian had, with his usual boundless enthusiasm, agreed to be one of my subjects. He'd sat for me for an hour, patient and still in a way he rarely was, trusting me completely. Now, I was watching his face emerge on the paper floating in the developer. First, the faint outlines, then the shadows of his cheekbones, the intense, searching look in his eyes that I had managed to capture. And as I watched his image bloom into existence under my hands, a profound and terrifying thought struck me. I was in love with him. It was not a gentle, poetic kind of love. It was a sharp, painful, gut-wrenching certainty that settled in my bones like a chronic illness. It reframed every memory we shared, coloring them with a new, dangerous intensity. His casual touches, a hand on my shoulder, a playful shove, became electric shocks. His laughter became a symphony I wanted to conduct. His presence became a necessity I hadn't realized I'd been cultivating. I saw, with sickening clarity, that my quiet observation had not been academic. It had been adoration. I was not a naturalist studying a creature. I was a worshiper studying his God. I pulled the print from the developer, my hands trembling, and moved it to the stop bath. The chemical scent was sharp, acrid, a stark contrast to the sudden, suffocating sweetness of my realization. I looked at his face on the paper, the light and shadow I had so carefully captured, and I felt a wave of panic. I had built my life on control, on observation from a safe distance. This feeling was the antithesis of that. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and it threatened to destroy the most important friendship I had ever known. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I locked it away. I built a room inside my mind, a dark room of my own, and I placed the knowledge of my love for Julian inside it. I closed the door, sealed the cracks, and resolved to never, ever let it see the light of day. I would be his friend, his anchor. That was the role I had chosen, and it was the only one I could safely play. For years, it was enough. The shift began on a rainy Tuesday in October, nearly 3 years after we'd graduated. The catalyst was not internal, not some failure of my own carefully constructed walls. It was external, a wrecking ball named Amelia. She had been Julian's girlfriend for 2 years, a woman as bright and vibrant as he was. I had thought they were perfect for each other. They were a matching set of sunshine. I had attended their parties, smiled through their public displays of affection, and quietly nursed the familiar, dull ache in my chest. I had even convinced myself I was happy for him, because his happiness was, in a way, my primary objective. He called me that afternoon. I was in my studio, a converted loft space that also served as my apartment, cleaning lenses. Rain hammered against the large industrial windows. His voice on the phone was hollowed out, a version of him I had never heard before. It was stripped of all its usual resonance, all its easy warmth. "She's gone," he said. Just that. "Gone where?" I asked, my own voice tight with a dawning dread. "Gone," he repeated, and this time his voice broke. "She packed her things. Said she felt trapped. Said I was too much. Too much." The idea was absurd. Julian was life itself, a supernova of energy and warmth. How could anyone find that to be too much? But I knew, in a way, what she meant. To love Julian was to stand close to a bonfire. It was exhilarating, but the heat could be overwhelming if you weren't prepared for it. Amelia, it seemed, had finally gotten burned. "Where are you?" I asked, already pulling on my jacket. "I don't know. Walking." "In the rain?" "Julian, go home. I'm coming over." "No," he said, his voice firm for the first time. "Don't. My place that's full of her. The smell of her perfume, her stupid ceramic mugs. I can't. Can I come to your place?" My studio was my sanctuary. It was a space of quiet, of order, of solitude. It was the one place I didn't have to pretend. But it was also his sanctuary, in a way. It was the place he came to escape the noise of his own life, to find a moment of stillness. "Of course," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. The doors unlocked. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a survivor of a shipwreck. He was soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and drawn. He stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the old wooden floorboards, looking utterly lost. He wasn't the Julian I knew. The bonfire had been extinguished, leaving behind only smoke and ash. Without a word, I took his wet jacket and handed him a towel. He didn't seem to know what to do with it. So I took it back and gently started drying his hair, the way you would with a child. He stood perfectly still, his eyes closed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. That was the first night of the new ritual. He didn't want to talk about it, not really. He just wanted to be. He sat on my large, worn leather couch, wrapped in a blanket I'd given him, and stared at the wall. I made him tea, which he held in his hands for warmth, but didn't drink. I put on a movie, something quiet and atmospheric that didn't demand attention. And as the night wore on, his exhaustion finally won. His head began to nod, and eventually, it slumped sideways, coming to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. This was new territory. We had always been tactile in a casual, brotherly way, a punch on the arm, a quick one-armed hug. This was different. This was an act of surrender. The weight of his head was both a profound burden and an unbearable gift. I could feel every strand of his damp hair against my neck. I could smell the rain, the city, and the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. I sat there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, my own muscles screaming in protest. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. The room I had built inside my mind, the one where my love for him was locked away, began to shake. I could feel the door rattling on its hinges. He stayed like that for over an hour, breathing deeply and evenly in his sleep. I didn't dare move. I just watched the flicker of the movie on the screen, the light dancing across his sleeping face. In sleep, the tension was gone. He looked younger, softer. The confident mask he wore for the world was gone, leaving only the man underneath, a man who was hurting and lost. And in that moment, the love I had tried so hard to contain surged through me, no longer sharp and painful, but a vast, protective wave of tenderness. I wanted to absorb all his pain. I wanted to rebuild his world. I wanted to be the one solid thing in his universe he could always hold on to. When the movie ended, the silence of the apartment was absolute, broken only by his soft breathing. I knew I should wake him, tell him he could take my bed. But the thought of moving him, of breaking this fragile connection, was unbearable. So I just sat there in the dark, his head on my shoulder, and I let myself feel it. For the first time in years, I unlocked the door to that hidden room, and I let the truth of my feelings wash over me. It was terrifying, and it was, in a strange way, beautiful. Eventually, my own exhaustion took over. My head drooped, and I fell into a strained, shallow sleep, propped up against the arm of the couch, with Julian a warm, solid weight against me. When I woke in the pale light of dawn, my neck was stiff and my arm was numb, but he was still there. He stirred as I shifted, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment, there was confusion, then a flicker of embarrassment as he realized where he was. "Sorry," he mumbled, sitting up quickly and running a hand through his now dry hair. I crashed. "It's fine," I said, my voice rough with sleep. "You needed it." He looked around the room, at the blanket pooled on the floor, the 2 empty teacups on the table. He looked back at me, his eyes full of a gratitude so profound it was almost painful to see. "Thanks, Leo," he said. "For everything." He didn't need to say more. I understood. I was his safe harbor. And that morning, as he showered and borrowed one of my shirts before heading off to face his dismantled life, a new pattern was set. My studio was no longer just my own. It was ours. That one night bled into a week, and then a month. The ritual became ingrained in the texture of our lives. Julian would finish his long days at the consulting firm where he worked, his mind abuzz with code and client demands, and instead of going to his own empty, ghost-filled apartment, he would come to mine. He never asked. He just appeared. I would hear his key in the lock. I'd given him one years ago, for emergencies, and a moment later he'd be there, dropping his bag by the door, his shoulders slumping as he shed the armor of the outside world. My space was the decompression chamber from his life. The couch became our territory. We'd eat takeout sitting side by side, our knees brushing. We'd watch movies, or I'd work on editing photos while he read. The silence between us grew, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was heavier, freighted with unspoken things, yet also more comfortable. It was a silence that acknowledged the gaping wound in his life without having to name it. And every night, without fail, he would fall asleep. Sometimes it was slow, a gradual surrender to exhaustion. Other times it was abrupt, like a switch being flipped. But it always ended the same way, with his head on my shoulder, or his long body stretched out with his feet in my lap, or, on a few memorable occasions, with him curled up against my side, his arm thrown carelessly across my stomach. Each time it happened, my internal world would spin into a state of high alert. My mind became a laboratory dedicated to the study of Julian. I analyzed the pressure of his touch, the rhythm of his breathing, the subtle shifts in his sleeping form. Was this just friendship? Was this just the desperate act of a grieving man seeking any port in a storm? Or was it something more? I would spend hours, while he slept, debating the evidence. The logical part of my brain, the part that composed photographs with geometric precision, told me not to read into it. He was my friend. He was hurting. He was straight. This was a temporary aberration, a period of convalescence. My role was that of the caregiver, the steady presence. To imagine anything else was a dangerous, self-destructive fantasy. But my heart, that traitorous, illogical organ, collected evidence for the prosecution. It noted the way that, even in sleep, he would sometimes shift closer to me, not away. It noted the mornings he'd wake up, find himself draped over me, and would only offer a sleepy, unbothered smile instead of the flustered apology I expected. It noted the way his touches were becoming less accidental and more settled. He was not just falling onto me anymore. He was placing himself there, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I was a cartographer, mapping the shifting borders of our relationship. The line between friendship and something else was becoming blurred, washed away by a slow, steady tide of physical intimacy. One evening, about 2 months into this new arrangement, the ritual escalated. He'd had a brutal week at work, topped off by a tense phone call with his mother, who was worried about him. He arrived at my door looking utterly depleted, his face pale and shadowed. He barely spoke, just collapsed onto the couch and pulled a blanket over himself. I sat down in my usual spot beside him, and for the first time, he didn't just lean against me. He lifted the blanket and looked at me, a clear, silent invitation. My breath caught. This was different. This was a conscious choice, not an accident of exhaustion. After a moment's hesitation that felt like a lifetime, I slid under the blanket with him. He immediately shifted, turning on his side to face me, and tucked his head into the space between my shoulder and my neck. He wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling himself flush against me. My body ignited. Every point of contact was a starburst of sensation. His breath was warm on my skin. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my ribs. This was no longer ambiguous. This was cuddling. This was something friends, at least straight male friends, did not do. Not like this. "Is this okay?" he whispered, his voice muffled against my shirt. The question was a lifeline. It gave me an out. I could say no. I could say it was weird. I could re-establish the boundaries, push him back to his side of the couch, and save myself from the inevitable heartbreak. It would be the smart thing to do, the self-preservative thing to do. "Yeah," I heard myself say, the word a hoarse whisper. "It's okay." It was the biggest lie and the most profound truth I had ever spoken. It was not okay for my sanity, for my carefully guarded heart. But having him there, holding him, feeling the tension seep out of his body as he finally relaxed into sleep, it felt more right than anything I had ever known. I lay there for hours, rigid with a mixture of terror and bliss, listening to the sound of his breathing. The darkroom door inside my mind was not just rattling anymore. It had been blown clean off its hinges. The feelings I had locked away were now roaming free in every corner of my being, and I was powerless to stop them. This became the new ritual. The couch was abandoned in favor of my bed. It started with a plausible excuse. "My back is killing me from that couch," he'd mumbled one night, and I, the ever-accommodating friend, had offered him my bed. I had fully intended to take the couch myself, but he had stopped me. "Don't be an idiot, Leo. It's a queen bed. There's plenty of room." So we shared a bed. The first few nights were a study in mutual, unspoken tension. We lay stiffly on our respective sides, a canyon of sheet and blanket between us, both pretending to be asleep long before we actually were. But the pretense slowly eroded. One night, I woke up to find the canyon gone. We were in the middle of the bed, tangled together. His leg was thrown over mine, his arm was around my waist, and my face was buried in his hair. Panic flared in my chest, hot and immediate. I started to pull away, but he made a soft, protesting noise in his sleep and pulled me closer. And so I stayed. Night after night, this became our new normal. We would fall asleep on opposite sides of a continent and wake up in a single, tangled landmass. The physical barrier was gone, but the emotional one remained, a vast, silent ocean between us. I still told myself it was about comfort. His comfort. I was the human equivalent of a weighted blanket, a warm body to ward off the ghosts of his failed relationship. I was a placeholder, a substitute. The thought was a constant, dull ache, but the physical reality of him, warm and solid and real in my arms, was a powerful anesthetic. I became an addict, living for the nights, for the quiet intimacy of our shared sleep. During the day, we were friends. We talked about work, about movies, about his slow, painful process of disentangling his life from Amelia's. But at night, in the dark, we were something else entirely. Something undefined and fragile and terrifyingly beautiful. I lived in a state of suspended disbelief. My photography suffered. I couldn't focus. My compositions felt flat, lifeless. All my creative energy, all my observational power, was being consumed by him. I was documenting him not with my camera, but with my senses. The exact shade of his skin in the morning light, the sound of his sigh as he fell asleep, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch and curl around mine in the middle of the night. These were my new photographs, a secret collection stored only in my memory. I knew it was unsustainable. This fragile bubble we had created was bound to pop. Sooner or later, he would heal. He would start dating again. He would move out of my space and back into his own life. And our nights of tangled limbs and shared breath would become a strange, unmentionable memory. The thought filled me with a dread so profound it was physically painful. I was living on borrowed time, and every night I spent holding him felt like I was stealing a happiness that wasn't mine to have. I was a thief, and eventually, I knew I would be caught. The bubble didn't pop. It was punctured, slowly and deliberately, by his question. That Tuesday evening, as we sat on the couch where it had all begun, the air thick with months of unspoken things, he finally gave voice to the ghost that haunted the space between us. "Do you ever feel like things have changed? Between us?" I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw that the fear I felt was mirrored in his own eyes. He wasn't just asking a question. He was holding out his hand in the dark, asking if I was there. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could lie. I could retreat back into the safety of our friendship, Pretend I didn't know what he was talking about. I could save myself from the potential devastation of the truth. Or, for the first time in my life, I could stop observing and start participating. I could stop composing the shot and step into the frame. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds of my old life. I took a breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. Yes, I said, and the single word felt like a confession, a prayer, and a declaration all at once. All the time, a wave of relief so profound it was almost visible washed over his face. The tension in his shoulders eased, and he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for months. He didn't smile, not exactly. It was something more fragile, more real. It was the look of someone who has finally found their way home after being lost for a very long time. He held my gaze, and in the depths of his eyes, I saw it. Not just gratitude, not just friendship. It was a reflection of my own yearning, a mirror of the love I had kept hidden for so long. The image was finally clear. He didn't say anything else for a long moment. The silence that fell was different again. It wasn't the comfortable silence of old friendship, nor the tense, freighted silence of our recent nights. This was a new silence, one of shared, acknowledged vulnerability. It was the quiet of a room where two people have just admitted to seeing the same ghost. We were no longer on opposite sides of a chasm. We were standing together, on the same fragile ground, the ruins of our old friendship at our feet, the shape of something new and unknown rising before us. Then he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, nothing like his usual impulsive energy. He raised his hand and gently cupped my jaw, his thumb stroking softly against my cheek. His touch was hesitant, questioning. It wasn't the familiar, comforting touch of a friend. It was the tentative, reverent touch of someone holding something precious and breakable. My skin tingled where he touched me, a fire spreading through my veins. I leaned into his hand, a silent surrender, closing my eyes. "Leo," he whispered again, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. It was a mixture of fear and wonder and a desperate, aching need. I opened my eyes. He was closer now, his face just inches from mine. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the slight tremble in his lower lip. The whole world had shrunk to the space between us. The city noise faded away. The room disappeared. There was only his face, his touch, his question hanging in the air. "Would it be okay," he started, his voice barely audible, "if I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. He was asking for permission to cross the final, irrevocable line. He was asking me to meet him on the other side. All the years of silent longing, of carefully guarded feelings, of terrified hope, culminated in this one, terrifying, beautiful moment. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. The fear of this being a mistake, a product of his grief. The fear of losing him entirely if this went wrong. But looking into his eyes, I saw that his fear was just as great as mine. He was just as lost, just as uncertain. And he was reaching for me, not as an anchor, not as a safe harbor, but as an equal, as someone who might, just possibly, feel the same way. I didn't answer with words. I answered by closing the small distance between us. The first touch of our lips was impossibly soft, hesitant, a question in itself. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was a gentle collision of two worlds that had been orbiting each other for years, finally touching. It tasted of salt from tears I hadn't realized I was crying, of hope, of 1,000 unspoken conversations. It was the most honest thing that had ever passed between us. When we pulled apart, we just looked at each other, our foreheads resting together. His hand was still on my cheek, his thumb still stroking my skin. My own hands had found their way to his waist, holding on as if I was afraid he might disappear. "Okay," he breathed out, a small, shaky laugh in his voice. "So it's not just me." "No," I said, my own laugh catching in my throat. "It's not just you." It was the beginning, but it was also, in its own way, an ending. It was the end of the silence, the end of the guessing, the end of the lonely observation from a distance. It was the end of my role as the quiet friend and the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. All I knew was that for the first time, the image in my mind and the reality in front of me were perfectly, beautifully in focus. And I was no longer just the photographer. I was part of the picture. The aftermath was not, as I might have fantasized, a seamless transition into a new, romantic reality. A confession, even a mutual one sealed with a kiss, does not magically erase years of established patterns or deep-seated fears. The morning after was quiet, but charged with a new, anxious energy. We moved around each other in my small kitchen, making coffee, with a strange, formal politeness. The easy, physical intimacy of the past few months had vanished, replaced by a hyper-awareness of the space between us. It was as if the kiss had erected new walls, transparent but solid, where none had existed before. We were two people who had shared a bed for months, yet now we were flinching if our hands brushed while reaching for the milk. Julian was the first to retreat. The confident man who had initiated the kiss was gone, replaced by a version of him I hadn't seen since the first day he'd shown up, soaked and broken, at my door. He was coiled tight with tension, his gaze skittering away from mine, his answers to my questions clipped and noncommittal. He drank his coffee standing up, his back to me, staring out the large studio window at the morning traffic. He looked like a man planning an escape. I should, get going, he said, his voice strained. Big day at work. Julian, I started, but he was already moving, grabbing his bag, avoiding my eyes. We'll talk later. He threw over his shoulder as he pulled the door open. It was a promise that sounded like a lie. And then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me in a silence that was louder and more painful than any I had ever experienced. The beautiful, fragile thing we had created the night before had shattered. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety and hurt. I replayed the kiss, his question, his words, over and over in my mind, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I misinterpreted everything? Was it all just a moment of grief-fueled confusion for him? Had I, by leaning into that kiss, by admitting my own feelings, pushed him away? The fear I had lived with for years, the fear of ruining our friendship, came rushing back, cold and suffocating. My studio, once my sanctuary, felt like a cage. The couch, the bed, every surface held the ghost of his presence, and now they mocked me with his absence. He didn't come over that night. He didn't call. He sent a single, terse text message around 10 o'clock. Swamped with work. Gonna crash at my place. Talk soon. The words were a clear dismissal. Talk soon was the new we'll talk later, a platitude meant to keep me at a distance. The ritual was broken. The door to my apartment, which had been his sanctuary, was now closed to him, locked by his own fear. I lay alone in the middle of my large bed, the space beside me a cold, empty expanse. The silence was absolute. I had never felt more alone. This went on for a week. A week of stilted texts, of avoided calls, of a gaping hole in my life where Julian used to be. I felt like I was going through withdrawal. My body ached for the familiar weight of him beside me. My apartment felt cavernous and empty. I tried to work, to lose myself in my photography, but it was useless. Every shadow, every composition, reminded me of him. I was a landscape photographer suddenly trapped in a windowless room. The world outside my own misery had ceased to exist. The hurt began to curdle into anger. Anger at him for his cowardice, for starting something he was too afraid to face. And anger at myself, for allowing myself to hope, for letting down my guard after years of careful vigilance. I had known the risks. I had known he was vulnerable. And I had let my own selfish desires cloud my judgment. I had failed in my one, most important role, to be his friend, his steady, unwavering anchor. At the end of that agonizing week, I knew I couldn't let it go on. The ambiguity was killing me. I would rather have a clean break, a definitive end, than live in this painful, silent limbo. I had spent my entire life observing, waiting. For once, I had to act. I had to force the confrontation. I put on my jacket, my hands shaking slightly, and walked out into the cold night. I walked the 12 blocks to his apartment, the building he had been avoiding for months, the building that was full of ghosts. I stood outside his door for a full 5 minutes, my heart pounding in my chest. What would I say? What if he didn't answer? What if he told me to leave, that it was all a mistake? The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping my throat. But the thought of returning to my empty apartment, to another night of silence, was even more terrifying. I took a deep breath and knocked. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I could hear faint music from inside. I knocked again, louder this time. Finally, I heard footsteps, and the lock turned. The door opened a few inches. Julian stood there, backlit by the hallway light of his apartment. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same t-shirt and sweatpants I'd seen him in 3 days ago on a video call he'd cut short. His hair was a mess, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He looked as haunted as I felt. "Leo," he said, his voice rough. He didn't open the door any wider. He was blocking the entrance, a physical barrier between me and his world. "Are you going to let me in?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It's not a good time." "I don't care," I said, pushing gently on the door. He offered no resistance, stepping back to let me in. The apartment was a disaster. Boxes were stacked against one wall, some half-packed, some half-unpacked. Clothes were draped over furniture. It was the space of a life in limbo. Amelia's ghost was palpable. A single, elegant vase stood empty on the mantelpiece, gathering dust. The air was stale, suffocating. He had fled one haunted house only to return to it, because he was more afraid of the new one we had started to build. "You've been avoiding me," I said, turning to face him. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I've been busy," he mumbled, refusing to meet my eyes. "No," I said, stepping closer. "That's not it. You've been scared, and you're hiding. Talk to me, Julian. Please, don't do this. Don't just disappear. After everything, you owe me a conversation." He finally looked at me, and his face was a mask of torment. "A conversation about what, Leo? About how I completely lost my mind. About how I used you." The words were a punch to the gut. "Is that what you think you did?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What else would you call it?" he shot back, his voice rising with a frantic, desperate energy. He started pacing, running a hand through his hair in that familiar, stressed gesture. "My life falls apart, and I run to you. I invade your space. I sleep in your bed. I lean on you until I'm surprised you can still stand up straight. And then I kiss you. I'm straight, Leo. I've been straight my whole life. I loved Amelia. And then I do that. What is that? What am I doing?" He stopped pacing and stood in the middle of the room, looking utterly lost. He looked like he was on the verge of shattering into a million pieces. The anger I had been nursing dissolved, replaced by that familiar, overwhelming wave of tenderness. He wasn't being cruel. He was terrified. He was a man whose entire understanding of himself had been upended, and he was flailing. "What are you so afraid of?" I asked gently. "Of everything," he exclaimed, his voice cracking. "I'm afraid that I'm just broken, that my grief is making me do crazy things. I'm afraid that I took advantage of you, of our friendship. You're the best friend I have, the only person who's ever really seen me. And I'm afraid I've destroyed that. And most of all," he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the floor. "What?" I prompted, stepping closer again until I was standing right in front of him. "What are you most afraid of?" He looked up, and his eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "I'm most afraid," he whispered, his voice trembling, "that it wasn't a mistake. I'm afraid of how right it felt. That kiss, it wasn't crazy. It was the sanest I've felt in months. And that terrifies me more than anything else." And there it was. The truth. Not just my truth, but his. It was messy and confusing and frightening, but it was real. He hadn't been using me. He hadn't been pretending. He had been just as lost in this new, uncharted territory as I was. He had reached for me not out of convenience, but out of a genuine, nascent feeling that his mind couldn't yet categorize or accept. I closed the remaining space between us and wrapped my arms around him. For a moment, he was stiff, resistant, and then, with a choked sob, he collapsed against me. He buried his face in my shoulder, and his body shook with the force of his weeping. He wasn't the strong, confident Julian the world knew. He was the man I had held on my couch, the man I had held in my bed. He was just Julian, and he was mine to hold. I held him for a long time, my hand stroking the back of his head, whispering reassurances into his hair. "It's okay. We're okay. It's just me." I let him cry, let him release the fear and confusion and grief he had been holding on to for so long. The ghosts in his apartment seemed to recede, chased away by the raw, honest sound of his pain. When his sobs finally subsided, he pulled back, though he didn't let go of me completely. His face was blotchy, his eyes red. He looked exhausted, but the frantic, panicked energy was gone. In its place was a quiet, weary clarity. "I don't know what this is, Leo," he said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what I'm doing, or what this means for me, for us." "I know," I said softly. "That's okay. We don't have to have it all figured out right now." I took his hand, my fingers lacing with his. His hand was cold, but it gripped mine tightly. "But we have to stop hiding from it. And from each other. No more disappearing." He nodded, a tear tracing a path down his cheek. "No more disappearing," he agreed. "Come home," I said. The words came out before I could think about them, but they felt right. My apartment wasn't just my home anymore. It was his, too. "Come back with me." He looked around his messy, sad apartment, at the boxes and the dust and the ghosts. Then he looked back at me, his eyes full of a weary, dawning hope. "Okay," he whispered. The walk back to my studio was quiet, but it was the first truly peaceful silence we had shared in a week. He held my hand the entire way, his grip firm and unwavering. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. The conversation had happened. The confession had been made, on both sides. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a screaming siren. It was something we could face together. When we got back to my apartment, it felt different. It was no longer a cage or a place of painful memories. It was home. It was our sanctuary, reclaimed. We didn't fall into our old routine. There was no pretense, no ambiguity. He followed me into the bedroom, and when I turned to look at him, he simply stepped forward and kissed me again. This kiss was different from the first. It was not a hesitant question, but a quiet affirmation. It was a promise, a beginning. That night, when we lay down in my bed, there was no canyon of sheets between us. We came together in the middle of the bed naturally, our limbs tangling in a familiar, comforting embrace. His head found its usual place in the crook of my neck. His arm wrapped around my waist. It was the same position we had been in 100 times before, but everything had changed. It was no longer an act of unconscious comfort. It was a conscious choice. It was an act of love. "Leo," he whispered into the darkness, just as I was drifting off to sleep. "Yeah. Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me." "Never," I promised, holding him tighter. And as I fell asleep, with the weight of him warm and solid against me, I knew that this was our new foundation. Not one built on silence and observation, but one built on honesty, on vulnerability, and on the terrifying, beautiful, undeniable truth that we had found our way to each other, not by accident, but by a slow, magnetic pull that had been there all along. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath, we were learning to rebuild. The weeks that followed were a process of careful, intentional construction. We were architects of a new kind of relationship, and we had no blueprint. We were building it day by day, conversation by conversation, touch by touch. The fear didn't vanish overnight, especially for Julian. There were moments when I would see a flicker of panic in his eyes, a shadow of the man who had hidden in his haunted apartment. He was recalibrating his entire identity, a process that was as disorienting as learning to walk again after a long illness. We talked. We talked more than we ever had in all our years of friendship. We lay awake in the dark, our bodies curled around each other, and we talked about everything. He told me about the suffocating pressure he'd felt with Amelia, the feeling of performing a version of himself he thought he was supposed to be, the happy-go-lucky, successful, straight man with the perfect girlfriend. He confessed that my quiet, calm presence had always been the only place he felt he could take off the mask, even before he understood why. He talked about his confusion, his fear of what his family would say, of what his friends would think. He laid all his anxieties bare, offering them to me like fragile, precious gifts. And I listened. I held him while he spoke, absorbing his fears. And I talked too. For the first time, I let him into my own internal world. I told him about the darkroom, about the day I saw his face emerge on the photographic paper and realized I was in love with him. I told him about the years of silent adoration, of my terror of losing our friendship, of the careful walls I had built around my heart. I confessed how his grief-stricken arrival had been both a gift and a torment, how every night I held him was a mixture of bliss and the certainty of future heartbreak. Sharing these confessions was like lancing a wound. It was painful, but it allowed the healing to begin. With every secret we shared, the foundation of our new reality grew stronger. The awkwardness that had followed our first kiss slowly melted away, replaced by a new, gentle intimacy. We learned a new language of touch. It was in the way he'd reach for my hand while we were walking down the street, his fingers lacing with mine without hesitation. It was in the way I would rest my head on his shoulder while we read on the couch, no longer questioning my right to be there. It was in the soft, brief kisses we would exchange in the kitchen while waiting for the coffee to brew, small affirmations of our new reality. Julian officially moved out of his apartment a month later. We spent a weekend packing up the last of his things. It was a strange, cathartic process. We worked together, a silent, efficient team. We sorted through the remnants of his old life, deciding what to keep, what to store, what to give away. When we came across a box of Amelia's things that she had never collected, he didn't flinch. He just quietly taped it up and labeled it. He was no longer haunted by her ghost. He was looking forward. Bringing his boxes into our studio, felt like the final, definitive act. My space, once a solitary sanctuary, transformed. His books found a home on my shelves, nestled amongst my photography collections. His ridiculously large collection of colorful running shoes created a cheerful chaos by the door. His favorite ceramic mug, not one of Amelia's, but a chipped, ugly one he'd had since college, sat next to my simple white one on the counter. The space was no longer just mine. It was a composite, a blend of his light and my shadow. It was us. My photography changed, too. The creative block I had been experiencing vanished. I started taking pictures again, but my focus had shifted. I was no longer interested in distant landscapes or sterile compositions. My lens was drawn to the small, intimate details of our life together. The way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing over our bed, the curve of his back as he slept, the intricate pattern of our intertwined hands on the blanket. My art was no longer about observation from a distance. It was about capturing the beauty of proximity, the texture of love. One afternoon, he found me developing a print in my small, makeshift darkroom. It was a picture I had taken of him a few days earlier. He had been sitting on the window ledge, reading, the city spread out behind him. He wasn't posing. He was just existing, completely at peace, bathed in the soft afternoon light. He was beautiful. He came to stand behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We watched together in the dim, red glow as his image slowly emerged on the paper in the developer tray. It was a mirror of that moment years ago, the moment of my terrifying realization. But this time, there was no panic. There was no fear. There was only a profound, quiet joy. "You see me," he whispered, his voice full of wonder as he looked at the portrait. "You always have." "I do," I said, leaning back against his chest. "And now, you see me, too." It wasn't a grand, dramatic romance. Our life together was built of small, quiet moments. It was cooking dinner together, our bodies brushing past each other in the small kitchen. It was him reading aloud to me from a book while I edited photos. It was the simple, profound comfort of falling asleep and waking up next to the person who knew you better than anyone else in the world. We had navigated the storm and found our way to the calm, quiet waters on the other side. The world outside our bubble continued on. Some of his friends were confused, some drifted away. His family had questions, some of them difficult. But Julian faced it all with a new, quiet strength I had never seen in him before. His identity was no longer something he performed for others. It was something he was building with me, something authentic and real. My own small world simply expanded to include him more fully, a seamless integration. Our friendship had not been destroyed. It had been transformed, deepened, elevated. It was still the foundation of everything we were, but now, something beautiful had been built upon it. There are still moments, late at night, when I lie awake and watch him sleep. I trace the line of his jaw, the curve of his shoulder, and I remember the years of silent yearning. I remember the terror and the hope, the dizzying anxiety of his head on my shoulder, the weight of our unspoken feelings. It all seems like a dream now, a story from another lifetime. The memory of the fear only serves to amplify the peace I feel now. The peace of being known, of being loved, of being home. Sometimes, he'll stir in his sleep, his hand reaching out for me, his fingers curling around mine with an unconscious, instinctual certainty. In those moments, I think about that ordinary Tuesday evening, about the question that cracked my world open. A question born of fear, but also of a desperate, courageous hope. It was the question that gave us a chance to stop being two separate entities orbiting each other and become one. We didn't need a map or a blueprint. We just needed to be brave enough to ask and brave enough to answer. And in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we found our way. We began to heal, and we began to build our life, one quiet, loving moment at a time.